Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of the Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on Edgar Markov. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. Other ways you can help support the channels with my Patreon. Patrons get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, and higher tier patrons get access to the VIP section of my Discord server as well. You can find a link to that down in the description too. In fact, patrons get a chance to see this video earlier. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Edgar Markov is a 4/4 Vampire Knight with first strike and haste for 3 generic, 1 red, 1 white, and 1 black. Whenever he attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire creature you control. He also has an Eminence ability where he creates a 1/1 black vampire creature token whenever you cast another vampire spell. This would make it pretty obvious that Edgar Markov is made for Vampire Tribal in mind. However, what makes Edgar especially dangerous is the utterly broken Eminence ability. Since this works from the command zone, you can have 2 vampires out on turn 1 already just by casting a 1-cost vampire. This is the direction I'm taking with this brew. Cast as many low-costed vampires as possible in order to swarm the board with enough vampires to aggro out and win as quickly as possible. This brew was heavily influenced by ISB Pathfinder, a user over at MTG Salvation and MTG Nexus. The mindset being, keep the average mana cost as low as possible in order to be as fast as possible. So thanks for the inspiration. Since the point of the deck is to play as quickly as possible, every 1-costed vampire and changeling creature that can be included is included, as of the recording of this video. This might seem inefficient since these creatures might not seem that impactful in a commander game. However, if you recall my Edric Spymaster of Trust video, all of the creatures in that build were very low-costed creatures, but they had some form of evasion. That made the deck incredibly fast and oppressive. That is the same mindset for this build. On their own, these vampires might not seem that great, but when you have 12 vampires by turn 3, you can see how this can get out of hand. Since the point for most of these is their casting cost, I will go through them very briefly and then summarize at the end. Bold Impaler is a 1/2, so it's already good for its cost. You can pump it +2/+0 for 3 mana, so it also has a decent mana sink. Definitely one of the better ones. Changeling Outcast is a shapeshifter, but it has changeling, so it counts as a vampire at all times. It's also unblockable, which is good to get damage through, but we'll see the vampire lords later on. Duskborn Skymarcher also has a form of evasion since it has flying. Its activated ability isn't really used since we want to go wide and not tall. Gul'Draz's Assassin can be leveled up, which is fine if we have nothing else to do with our mana that turn. It could work to kill off a Weenie, Hate Bear, Mana Dork, or other utility creature. Level it up high enough and it can really do something. Gul'Draz's Vampire can become a 3/2 fairly quickly with this deck. It also gains Intimidate, which is another form of evasion. Insolent Neonate can be sacrificed for a loot effect, which isn't bad if we need to draw a card after combat or during another player's turn. Similar to Bold Impaler, Knight of the Ebon Legion is a 1/2 that can pump itself +3/+3 while also gaining Death Touch for just 3 mana, showing why this one is a rare and the latter is a common. It also gets a +1/+1 counter at the end of your turn if a player lost 4 or more life that turn, which is almost all the time in this deck. Pulse Tracker and Vicious Conquistador are amazing for just 1 mana since they hit everyone at the table for 1 life when attacking. The Conquistador is slightly better since it has a higher toughness. Quack Vampires has Multi-Kicker, which is a good mana sink if the game drags on, which makes it a good late game as well as early game card. It also has Swamp Walk, which is also decent evasion. Shadow Alley Denizen isn't really used to its full potential here unless our black creatures get haste as well. At the very least, it gives Intimidate to Edgar Markov the turn we cast it since he has haste. Skymarcher Aspirant is a 2/1, so it's already good for its cost. It doesn't have flying right away, you have to have the City's Blessing first. But having 10 or more permanents in this deck is child's play, so it's basically a 2/1 with flying for just 1 mana, unless it's one of the first spells you cast in a game. Stromkirk Noble has protection from humans, which is a form of evasion considering that human is the most common creature type in Magic. It can also pump itself with +1/+1 counters whenever it deals combat damage to a player. If cast during the early game, it can get very dangerous very quickly. Vampire Cutthroat has Lifelink as well as Skulk, which is another form of evasion. Lifelink is also relevant in the deck, but we'll see why later on. So being able to gain lots of life when our vampires are pumped is definitely a plus. Vampire of the Dire Moon has Death Touch and Lifelink, which is great for its mana cost. It makes opponents think twice about blocking it, and you can keep it open as a blocker just in case. As with Vampire Cutthroat, we'll soon see why life gain is relevant in the deck. Vampire Lacerator is a 2/2, which is amazing for its casting cost. We lose 1 life during our upkeep unless an opponent has 10 life or less. Starting with 40 life makes that life loss negligible. The deck also has ways of counteracting some of the life we lose with some effects as well as creatures with lifelink, like we saw on Vampire Cutthroat and Vampire of the Dire Moon. This Receiver is great because not only is it a one-costed vampire that will trigger Edgar when cast, but it can also be used as a free sacrifice outlet. Not only that, but you can use your vampire fodder to dig through your deck until you find the card needed. It can also attack too, so it's definitely one of the better one-costed vampires in the deck. Universal Automaton is quite simply just a one-costed vampire. Its only pro is its casting cost. Since it's one generic mana, we can use any mana to cast it, so we don't have to worry about colors or anything to cast it. Last but not least is Serra Ascended. Although not a vampire, it's still a 6/6 flyer with lifelink for just 1 mana, so it's an amazing beater in the deck as well as a way for us to recover our life. Besides these one-costed creatures, the deck does run a handful of higher-costed creatures capped at 3 mana because they're still relatively cheap for the deck. Adanto Vanguard is basically a 3/1 when it matters for just 2 mana. It can also gain Indestructible without investing any additional mana. This definitely makes it worth including in the deck. The same goes for Bloodghast. It's a 2/1 for 2 mana, but it can be recurred from the graveyard whenever we drop a land. Additionally, it gets haste whenever an opponent has 10 or less life. Bloodthrone Vampire is an amazing beater since it can pump itself for free by merely sacrificing a creature, which is also a bonus since it's a free sacrifice outlet. Yahenni Undying Partisan is the only 3-costed vampire in this section. 3 mana is a high cost in this deck, but Yahenni can become indestructible for free by simply sacrificing a creature, which also makes him a free sacrifice outlet. He also has haste and can pump himself with +1/+1 counters whenever a creature's opponents control die. What's great about creatures like Yahenni and Adanto Vanguard is that if someone wipes the board, they remain. Yahenni in particular will not only remain but be much stronger than before, potentially able to take out an opponent. So this can make the table think twice before casting that wrath. The deck can also make vampire tokens other ways thanks to Legion's Landing and Bloodline Keeper. Legion's Landing creates a vampire token with lifelink when it enters the battlefield, but it can just storm so easily into Adanto the First Fort, a land that can make a vampire token with lifelink for just 3 mana and tapping. So it also makes for a great mana sink when you have nothing else to do with your mana. Bloodline Keeper makes 2/2 vampires with flying for just tapping. It's also incredibly easy to transform into Lord of Lineage. Lord of Lineage can also make 2/2 vampires for just tapping, but it also has a Lord effect giving our other vampires +2/+2. On the topic of lords, let's see what other vampire lords the deck has. Falconwrath Gorger may not seem like such a lord at first glance, but it's a one-costed vampire that gives madness to all of our vampires. We could use our vampires to any discard effect in order to have them enter the battlefield the turn before ours, or choose them as what's being discarded when affected by an opponent's discard effect. Indulgent Aristocrat isn't a free sacrifice outlet, but for just 2 mana and sacrificing a creature, all of our vampires get a +1/+1 counter, so it includes itself. It also has lifelink, which as I mentioned earlier is great here. Oh, and it only costs 1 mana to cast, which is definitely great to drop in the early game. Cordial Vampire is similar, but it's triggered effect so you can't activate it whenever you want. That being said, with so many sacrifice outlets in the deck, it practically is an activated ability more so than a triggered ability. It's also not only limited to your own creatures, it's with any creature dies. So if your opponent's creatures are dying, all of your vampires get a +1/+1 counter, including itself. Sanctum Seeker makes our vampires deal damage, so to speak, even if they end up getting blocked. However, this isn't just life loss, we're draining that life too, since we're gaining that same amount of life. Again, helping us recover life, which is great. Lords per se are Legion Lieutenant, Captivating Vampire, and Stormkirk Captain. Each of these pump other vampires +1/+1, while Stormkirk Captain also gives them first strike. Captivating Vampire is a great way to add even more vampires to our side. We can even use it to make our own few non-vampire creatures into vampires. We can activate this ability at instant speed, so we can also use it to steal creatures that are attacking us for some combat tricks and hijinxes. Speaking of combat hijinxes, the deck has a couple of combat tricks and effects. Iroa's God of Victory gives menace to all of our creatures, and he also makes them take no damage when attacking. This is not just limited to combat damage either. If anyone shocks any of our attackers in response to anything, our attackers won't receive that damage. Iroas only costs 4, which is relatively cheap, but in this deck it's reaching the top of the curve. He's also indestructible, which is a plus. The deck doesn't have many red and or white pips, but once it's a creature, it's yet another danger on the board. Shared Animosity is another attack-based boon. Each attacker we control gets +1/+0 for each other attacker that shares its creature type. This card is just outright broken in this deck. The amount of vampires being cast and created means that whenever they all attack together, this enchantment makes it very easy to take out an opponent or two with overwhelming forces. Reconnaissance is a great combat trick since we can take advantage of the different steps of the combat phase to take the most advantage from it. The combat phase is divided into start combat, attack step, blockers step, damage step, and end of combat. What you do is you activate Reconnaissance in response to the end of combat step of the combat phase after damage has already been dealt. This untaps all of the creatures you use to attack and leaves them ready as potential blockers for any other opponent's combat phase. Vault of the Archangel is another great combat trick. Being able to give our creatures Death Touch is great since opponents may not want to trade their good creatures for our weenies. We can also give Death Touch to any potential blockers we have to deter attacks as well. The Vault also gives Lifelink, which is great. Paying the ability is rough since it's 4 mana plus tapping the land, but it's still a decent mana sink if you have nothing else to do. However, combat isn't the only route to victory with this deck. It does have its share of win cons, one of them being Malachor Blood Witch. Similar to Grey Merchant of Asphodel, when the Witch enters the battlefield, each opponent loses life equal to the amount of vampires you have on the battlefield. Keep in mind that when you cast it, Edgar triggers and you get the vampire creature token before the Witch enters the battlefield, so that will be one more to count for the effect. You also gain all that life back, which is great. Granted, this depends on our board state, but this is not the case for some of the deck's other win cons. These can win inconsequentially and with little more effort than simply existing on the battlefield as you play your game as normal. For example, Impact Tremors and Perforce God of the Forge don't require you to do anything since they passively deal damage to the table every time a creature enters the battlefield under your control. Perforce is a bit costly at 4 mana, but he's indestructible. He's also a mana sink that can pump all your creatures +1/+0 for just 3 mana, so all of his abilities are incredibly relevant in this deck. Goblin Bombardment is a good way to finish off opponents after combat if the attack wasn't enough to kill them off. You can simply sacrifice your creatures for free in order to deal 1 damage for each one. This can definitely help give those final points of damage left to eliminate a player or two. Not only that, but all these sacrifice effects can be further weaponized thanks to Blood Artist, Cruel Celebrant, and Zulaport Cutthroat. Whenever one of our creatures die, we can convert that into life loss for our opponents. Of these, only Zulaport Cutthroat isn't a vampire, but that doesn't really matter since it hits all opponents and only costs 2 mana, so it's worth having in the deck. Even then, these creatures are even better since their effect also gains you life. Now, I've mentioned the importance of life gain quite a lot in this deck tech, and that's because Edgar Markov tends to be the arch enemy once revealed in the command zone. The only way to really get rid of a commander with the Eminence ability is to eliminate the player piloting it. So if the table is going to gang up on us, we need that life gain. However, another reason we need life gain is because most of the card advantage effects in the deck require life. Necropotus is one of the best cards in the deck. A bit hard to cast at triple black, it's not really that big an issue since the deck can fix mana fairly easily. That being said, being able to draw a card at the cost of 1 life is nothing to scoff at. We can draw pretty deep into the deck if we have a high enough life total, which as seen before isn't that difficult to pull off. Dark Confidant is another effect that requires life. Although it isn't a vampire, it doesn't really matter. The good thing about the deck having such a low curve is that we can get card advantage without the risk of losing too much life to what we're getting from the top of our library. Same goes for Bolas' Citadel. Topping the curve as the most expensive card in the deck besides Edgar himself, this card is just too good to pass up in this deck. The deck doesn't need to run that many lands due to the low curve. Thanks to that low curve, we can cast a bunch of spells off the top of our library with a very small investment in life. If that weren't enough, we can tap it and sacrifice 10 non-land permanents in order to have all opponents lose 10 life, so we can also close out a game too. Yawgmoth Thran Physician is another non-vampire creature in the deck, but he's too good to pass up. 4 mana is a bit costly, but his abilities more than make up for it. He's a free sacrifice outlet that requires life to pay, but doing so draws us a card and puts a -1/-1 counter on a creature, meaning we can get quite the engine going with the previously mentioned effects from cards like Blood Artist and the like. He can also proliferate via a discard outlet. It's not free, but at least we can use it and discard vampires that have madness thanks to Falconwrath Gorger. He also has protection from humans as a bonus, so we can even get some damage in with him too. Timon the Weaver is a combat-based card draw that also requires paying life, but it's still a great way to draw 3 cards a turn. Paying 3 life for no mana for 3 cards is definitely a great deal. She might not be a vampire, but she's a 2/2 with lifelink besides her other abilities, so she's definitely a welcome in the deck. Minions Mermaids can also draw us a ridiculous amount of cards for the same 1 life per card ratio. However, we don't control how much life we pay, we lose life per creature we control. If we control more creatures than our life total, we shouldn't cast it because then we die. That being said, this card is crazy good if we have a healthy board state as well as a healthy life total. Champion of Dusk does the same thing when it enters the battlefield, but the card draw depends just on the vampires we control, which is almost the same effect as Minions Murmurs. Being a vampire means that it will trigger Edgar when cast, so we get an extra card drawn thanks to that. It's also a 4/4, so it helps compensate that high mana cost. Dusk Legion Zealot is just an elvish visionary that takes a life away, but it's still a cheap vampire to cast in order to get Edgar triggers, and we get a card draw on top of that, so it does quite a lot for just 2 mana. We can also draw cards from sacrificing Silent Clearing or Some Big Canyon. We don't need to pay life for that ability, but we do need to pay life to tap it for mana, which could eventually add up. Liliana Dreadhorde General is the only card effect draw out of all of these that doesn't require losing life at all to perform. Whenever a creature we control dies, we get to draw a card, and that's it. We can also trigger this ourselves by sacrificing our creatures to our discard outlets. She's a bit costly at 6 mana just like Bolas' Citadel, but if games drag on too long, we can't afford to run out of steam. Her other abilities are also relevant. She can create another attacker. It's not a vampire, but it's a free 2/2, so no complaints here. Her -4 can be more brutal against opponents than us since we have fodder to spare. Her ultimate probably won't be achieved since most games with Edgar tend to end quickly. Even so, it's not the point of running her in the deck. Also, hitting the ultimate might get rid of her if you use up all her loyalty. Her static ability is where it's at in this deck though. Fortunately though, Liliana isn't the only way to disrupt opponents. The deck also runs a fair suite of spells just for that. Anguish Unmaking, Utter End, and Chaos Warp are all instant speed ways of getting rid of most irksome permanents. We lose 3 life to Anguish Unmaking, so it's good to be gaining life in the deck. Utter End is a bit expensive, but we can't run a deck without responses. And being able to have a much needed silver bullet is priceless. Path to Exile is an incredibly cheap solution, but only for creatures. The owner gets to fetch a basic land, but the mana acceleration isn't that important since games with Edgar tend to end quickly. This spell is usually used against a Voltron creature swinging in for the kill, or against a very important combo piece or utility creature. Imp's Mischief is another great response. This can function as a way to steal an opponent's draw X spell, extra turn spell, etc. The applications are practically endless. Another great thing about this spell is that no one really expects it. The deck isn't running green or blue, so it usually slips people's minds that white, black, and red have ways to manipulate or counter spells. We lose life due to its ability, so it's another thing to be grateful to the life thing for. Grasp of Fate is an amazing enchantment here since it can exile the worst offender from each battlefield, all for just 3 mana. Enchantments aren't as easy to get rid of, so fortunately you win the game before someone gets rid of it. Since the deck is reliant on our board state, a well-timed board wipe can really set us back if we don't have any of our benefits in play. For example, cards like Yahenni, Zulaport Cutthroat, etc. An overloaded Cyclonic Rift isn't a problem here since we can rebuild our board state incredibly easy afterwards. However, we still have to be careful. This is why the deck runs Boros Charm. Not only will this make our permanents indestructible, but we can also give a big creature double strike if it meant closing out the game, or likewise giving 4 damage to the face in order to end the game. Remember how I said that Cyclonic Rift was not a problem? We can actually Cyclonic Rift ourselves with Scapegoat. It only costs 1 mana and sacrificing a creature, and we can return any number of creatures we control to their owner's hands at instant speed. This means that in response to a board wipe, we can just return all of our creatures to our hand except for 1. Since the vast majority are vampires, we'll also probably get our tokens back as well when we recast them. Another amazing card to take advantage of opponents' board wipes is Faith's Reward. Cast after a board wipe, and we'd probably be the only one with our creatures on the board. Sure, we won't have our tokens, but we'll probably have a board free of blockers for us to get that win in next turn. We can also use Faith's Rewards proactively. We can sacrifice all of our non-token creatures to cards like Goblin Bombardment or Viscera Seer for value, especially with cards like Cruel Celebrant or Liliana on the battlefield. And once we've done that, we can cast Faith's Reward and get all of our creatures back to do it again. This is another way to take advantage of these effects and potentially win the game thanks to it. Now, in order to do all these things, we need mana. Since the deck is fast, we want fast mana as well. Chrome Mox and Mana Crypt are great as free mana rocks. We can always imprint a weak vampire to Chrome Mox in order to accelerate our game even more. The Crypt is great at counteracting those few spells that are higher on the end of the curve. Soul Ring and Arcane Signet are also included. The Signet might be a bit costly, but once you cast it, you can tap it to cast any 1-costed vampire. So in the worst case, it just increases the cost of a 1-drop to a true drop, but then you have the mana advantage afterwards. Rounding out the mana acceleration is Smothering Tithe. I found that so few people pay the 2 because they lose 2 mana just to deprive you of 1. Since our cards are so cheap, getting even 1 treasure token is already a huge boost. Getting 3 in a round is insane. People usually pay 2 when playing against Edgar, which just slows them down anyways. We're moving pretty quickly, so it's still a win-win for us regardless of the choice they make. Phyrexian Tower is also a great way to get a slight boost in mana, all for sacrificing a creature. This can make the difference between being 1 turn ahead or in the same place as opponents. The rest of the deck is just the lands. The deck's running all 10 fetch lands, all 3 shock lands, all 3 dual lands, all 3 filter lands, Command Tower, Mana Confluence, City of Brass, Reflecting Pool, and Cavern of Souls, as well as 3 snow-covered swamps, 2 snow-covered plains, and 1 snow-covered mountain, in case any opponent has anything that benefits us for running them. The reason they're in these amounts is because the colors in the deck aren't evenly distributed. The deck is mostly black. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Edgar Markov. This deck aims to win as quickly as possible with either going wide incredibly fast, comboing off, or a combination of both. Keep in mind that not only can you create a massive horde of creatures to swing at with your opponent's faces, but you can also weaponize their entering and leaving the battlefield. That maximizes the amount of damage dished out by the weenies. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.